dive into a topic that you might not normally think about when it comes to schools, and that is fugitivity. I know when you hear that word, you probably think about someone escaping or running away, but we're going to be looking at it kind of differently today, more as this like way of creating new ways of being and new ways of learning. And this is especially important when communities were facing some like really tough challenges. And this idea actually comes from this really interesting ACME article. And knowing you, I know you love to like look at things from new perspectives.
Yeah, that's what makes this depth dive so fascinating. It's all about how we can understand community schools in a new way. Now, for those of you familiar with community schools, we're not just talking about after-school programs or, parent volunteers. We're going even deeper than that. We're going to talk about how community schools can become these like really important sites for what the article calls necessary fugitivity, especially when powerful institutions are kind of like threatening the well-being of a community.
Yeah, like a safe space almost,
Yeah.
where they can develop these like unique ways to navigate, all the challenges they're facing.
It is like a space for resilience and self-determination. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Definitely. And, speaking of powerful stuff, what about the idea of freedom? Like, what does that word even mean? I think a lot of times people think about freedom this like one very specific way, but what if there are like all these different ways to understand what freedom is and how to actually experience it?
And that's where community schools come in.
Exactly. And we're going to use this deep dive to explore how community schools, through what the ACME article calls these fugitive methods, they can help marginalized young people and their families, not only achieve, but like really hold on to this sense of freedom in their lives, like actually
Yep.
make it happen every day.
It's about giving them the tools to create their own freedom. And for those of you who are already super familiar with community schools, you know all about the partnerships and the integrated services and the community focus. But today we're going to kind of flip the script and look at their potential in a whole new light. This idea of fostering resilience and self-determination through these fugitive methods.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea of fugitivity as method.
Yeah.
The ACME article, has this really interesting perspective. It's saying it's not just about those historical stories of escape, like, the Maroon communities, the communities of formerly enslaved people who built these settlements after escaping slavery.
Incredible stories of resilience.
They are. But the article's saying that it's bigger than that. Fugitivity is like this way broader way of understanding how communities resist and create new possibilities even today, especially when they're facing like constant racial injustice and dehumanization.
And you know what's so cool is how the article uses history to really ground this concept.
Yeah.
They talk about this advertisement from 1784 in Jamaica, and it lists these 10 people who had run away: Ruth, Silver, Nellie, Bess, Samson, Dick, Nancy, Mary, Humphrey, and young Nellie. And just seeing their names listed like that, it's a powerful reminder that these were real people, individuals who chose to resist being treated as property.
Right. And what's so powerful about this is that they weren't just like acting out of desperation on their own. The article points out how this resistance was collective. Like we see families escaping together. And in Ruth's case, they think she was trying to reach a Maroon settlement where her husband was. So, that says a lot about the support systems they had, the resistance networks. They were building community and claiming space in a way that directly challenged the whole system of slavery.
And that idea of community building is so important. Think about community schools as kind of like modern-day Maroon camps, not for physical escape, but for helping students develop the skills and knowledge they need to overcome systemic barriers.
It's like a different kind of escape, right?
Yeah.
An escape from limited opportunities.
Exactly. And the article uses this quote from Toni Cade Bambara that I think really captures this. It says, "Making oneself unavailable for servitude." It's not just about running away physically. It's this deep down refusal to be defined by the oppressive conditions you're forced to live in. It's about knowing your worth.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The ACME article argues that these historical examples of fugitivity, they aren't just, things that happened in the past. They actually give us a lot of insight into the struggles people face today against all kinds of oppression. It's not just about slavery anymore.
Right. It's like these patterns of domination keep repeating throughout history, but so do the ways that people resist.
Exactly. And, even in today's world, with all the economic inequality and the shrinking social safety nets, it's about recognizing those patterns and understanding the creative ways people push back.
And the authors break down this idea of fugitivity as method into 3 main categories: knowledge-making, kin-making, and place-making. And we can use these categories to understand how community schools can really help cultivate this necessary fugitivity.
So let's start with the first one, Fugitive knowledge making. Like,
Mhm.
how can community schools become these places where different ways of knowing are not only valued, but are created and shared?
Well, they give this example called underground curriculum networks, and it's a great example of how fugitive knowledge making works. It's like educators, parents, students all working together to develop and share curricula that really center the experiences of those who are often marginalized. Like Black and Indigenous knowledge, the history of mutual aid, stories that you don't usually hear in mainstream education.
So it's about going beyond the traditional textbooks and classrooms.
Yeah, yeah. They're learning in community centers and local businesses, even online, using encrypted digital libraries. They're creating and valuing knowledge that speaks to their own realities and experiences.
It's almost like they're creating their own intellectual self-defense system.
Exactly. And the ACME article connects this to the idea of Black study.
Can you say a bit more about that? What is Black study and how does it relate to this?
Sure. So the article talks about Black study as this collaborative effort to challenge what they call disciplinary enclosures. Those are basically those traditional boundaries between different academic subjects, like math, science, history, all separate from each other. And sometimes those boundaries can actually prevent us from understanding complex issues in a more holistic way.
Like, you need to see the connections between things.
Exactly. And so Black Study, it breaks down those walls between subjects and it helps communities create knowledge that is directly relevant to their lived experiences. The article says the goal is to become undisciplined together, like to move beyond those traditional limitations and see the world in a new way, on their own terms, and in a way that's empowering.
It's about taking back the power to decide what knowledge is important and how it should be learned.
Absolutely.
And the pasted text actually gives some really concrete examples of how this happens in real life. They're like liberatory assessment practices.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So instead of always relying on standardized tests, which can sometimes, reinforce inequalities because they're not designed with everyone in mind, community schools can use different ways to assess learning, ways that are connected to the community's own culture and ways of knowing, like oral storytelling traditions, for example, or community-based projects that address local issues, or even intergenerational knowledge sharing, where elders teach young people important skills and stories from their own lives.
It's so cool. It's not just about checking boxes on a standardized test. It's about valuing different ways that people express their knowledge and skills. And it challenges the idea that there's only one right way to be successful.
Exactly.
And what about this idea of stealth learning in public spaces? That one really caught my eye. It's like turning the whole community into a classroom.
I know, right?
Mm.
It's about using everyday spaces for learning, like going on field trips to places that might not be on the official curriculum, or looking at street art as a form of social commentary and history, or even exploring radical bookstores that offer different perspectives. It's about creating these learning experiences that happen outside of the traditional school setting and outside the control of policies that might try to limit what students can learn.
It's like they're learning all the time without even realizing it.
In a way, yeah, and it makes learning so much more relevant and engaging.
I love it. And for young people who feel like their voices aren't being heard or they're being ignored by the larger institutions, the Hacktivist Youth Media Collective's example is so powerful.
It is, because it gives them a way to take control of their own narratives, like using encrypted channels to communicate online or creating their own zines to share their perspectives, even starting their own independent radio stations. These are all tools that young people can use to document their experiences, to speak out against injustice, and to build a collective voice that can't be silenced.
It's about owning your story and sharing it with the world on your own terms.
Exactly.
So we've talked about how community schools can be these like amazing centers for fugitive knowledge making. Now let's move on to the second fugitive method, kin making and refuge. How do these schools help build those important connections and offer a sense of safety and belonging, especially when the outside world can feel so threatening or even hostile?
Well, one powerful example is what they call Black and brown sanctuary spaces. These are schools that are pushing back against those zero-tolerance policies that have led to so much over-policing and criminalization of students, particularly students of color. They're saying no to that. And they're creating their own internal support systems and ways to hold each other accountable that are rooted in restorative justice, not punishment.
So they might create these spaces within the school where students can feel safe and supported. Or they might use conflict mediation circles to help resolve disagreements peacefully. And they might even have student-led accountability structures. It's about building a sense of safety and justice from within the community instead of relying on external systems that haven't always served them well. But I'm curious, like, how does a principal actually navigate that? Because there could be pushback from the district or from law enforcement.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And it's not always easy. It takes a lot of courage and commitment. I think a key part of it is building trust with the community, like really being transparent about why they're doing things this way and emphasizing that it's all about creating the best possible learning environment for all students. And that means making sure everyone feels safe and supported. It often involved having open and honest conversations with families, with staff, and with the wider community.
And I think this connects back to the ACME article's idea of fugitivity as this rejection of dehumanization. When schools create these sanctuary spaces, they're sending a clear message. They're saying, we're going to protect our own, we're going to create our own systems of care and accountability.
Right. It's like a powerful act of resistance against those forces that try to dehumanize and marginalize them.
And it reminds me of those historical maroon communities. Those were like porous spaces of refuge that gave shelter and a sense of belonging to people who were escaping from slavery. They were creating their own communities based on their own values.
That's a great connection. And another example that really fits in here is mutual aid as school infrastructure. This idea highlights how important it is for schools to become central points for meeting the basic needs of the community.
So things like food security, housing, childcare, transportation, all those things that can be huge barriers for families who are struggling.
Exactly. And when schools step up to address those needs, they become more than just places of learning. They become these vital hubs where resources are shared and redistributed. And it challenges that narrative of scarcity that's often used to justify inequality. It's about creating alternative systems support that are rooted in the community itself.
And it puts a huge responsibility on the shoulders of principals and superintendents,
Yeah.
especially when external institutions are using their power in ways that threaten the well-being of their communities. They have to step up and be leaders.
For sure. When those kinds of threats arise, the school needs to be that anchor of refuge, a safe haven. Just like those maroon settlements back in the day. Remember we were talking about Ruth and how she was probably heading towards one of those settlements? They weren't just about escape. They were about survival and building a better future together. And principals and superintendents have this amazing opportunity to create that same kind of refuge and unwavering support within their schools.
Absolutely. So we've covered knowledge making and kin making. Let's dive into the third piece of this puzzle, fugitive placemaking for freedom. How do community schools help create those spaces, both physical and, metaphorical, where people can actually feel and experience a sense of freedom?
One example that really stands out is this idea of refusal of traditional school hours and structures. When schools offer things like alternative schedules, night classes, weekend programs, and even online learning, they're basically saying, we understand that not everyone fits into the traditional mold of school.
Like a 9-to-5 schedule doesn't work for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And especially for working class families who might have multiple jobs or unpredictable schedules, those traditional structures can be a huge barrier to education. So these community schools are adapting. They're challenging those rigid state mandates, and they're saying, we're going to make education accessible to everyone. And in doing so, they're also prioritizing student autonomy, giving them more control over their own learning, which is really empowering.
I love that. What about these ancestral and land-based learning initiatives? I think those are so important for helping students connect with their heritage and broaden their understanding of education beyond just, textbooks and tests.
They're incredible. They're bringing back those traditional ways of knowing that have been marginalized for so long. So you have schools incorporating urban farms into their curriculum, or offering foraging programs where students learn how to identify and gather wild foods, or even partnering with indigenous communities to learn about land stewardship practices. It's all about reconnecting students to the land and to the wisdom of their ancestors. And it's a powerful form of resistance against the commodification of education.
It's like they're learning to be stewards of the earth and of their own cultures.
Exactly. And there's this other example called intergenerational educational resistance that I find really fascinating. It's about bringing elders and youth together in the learning process, like having elders co-teach classes or even establishing what they call underground freedom schools within the community. And it's a way to preserve cultural memory and to pass on those strategies of resistance that have been used in past struggles for social justice.
It's like recognizing that the fight for freedom is an ongoing process and that there's so much wisdom to be gained from those who came before us.
And it connects to this idea that freedom is a place. It's a quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore that the article mentions, and it's saying that creating freedom is an active process. It's about building those spaces where freedom can exist and thrive.
And that brings us to the last example, diplomas without the state. Now, this one really challenges our assumptions about what counts as a legitimate education.
It does. It's about imagining alternative systems of recognition that value the kind of deep transformative learning that happens in these community spaces. Learning that goes beyond the traditional curriculum and standardized tests. It's about saying that you don't need a piece of paper from the state to prove that you've learned and grown. And it aligns with the article's argument about challenging those traditional power structures and creating alternative spaces where different forms of knowledge and achievement are recognized and celebrated.
All of this really highlights the fact that there isn't just one way to understand freedom. The ACME article talks about this too. It contrasts this kind of like abstract, almost philosophical idea of freedom with a more grounded understanding of freedom based on the experiences of people who have been actively resisting oppression.
And what the article points out is that for enslaved people, the act of running away, that fugitivity, it didn't magically transport them to some perfect state of freedom.
Yeah.
It was often a really dangerous journey towards freedom. And even once they escaped, they still faced the constant threat of being captured and punished.
So it was more about taking a step in the right direction, even if it wasn't a guarantee of immediate safety or freedom.
Right. And that really changes how we think about these fugitive methods that we're talking about in the context of community schools.
So it's not necessarily about completely escaping from the systems of oppression. Because let's be real, for a lot of marginalized communities, that's not always possible.
It's more about creating spaces of resistance within those systems and finding ways to exercise agency and autonomy even when you're facing all kinds of limitations and barriers. It's about those everyday acts of freedom, the small victories that add up over time.
So when we look at those examples, we talked about the underground curricula, the sanctuary spaces, the flexible learning schedules. Those were all ways that community schools are helping marginalized young people and their families to create and maintain a sense of freedom in their lives. It's not just some abstract concept, it's something they're actively building and practicing every day.
And it's about fostering that sense of self-determination and community empowerment. It's about equipping them with the tools and the knowledge to come up with their own solutions to the challenges they face and to resist those forces that try to hold them back.
So to sum it all up, it sounds like when community schools really embrace this spirit of innovation, collaboration, and equity, they can become these incredibly important sites for this necessary fugitivity. They offer pathways to knowledge that's relevant and empowering. They build those crucial support networks, and they nurture that ongoing pursuit of freedom for marginalized communities.
And for those of you out there who are principals or superintendents, I want to emphasize how much potential your schools have to be more than just places where kids go to learn. They can be sanctuaries, they can be centers of resistance, they can be places where communities come together to build a better future.
And for our listeners, we want to leave you with this question to think about. When you look at the community schools, what other fugitive methods do you see happening? Maybe they're subtle, maybe they're not even intentional. Or what new fugitive methods could you imagine being created to help empower students and families? We encourage you to really think about how these spaces could be so much more than just schools. They could be centers of strength, resilience, and self-determination for the whole community.